Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. We have some breaking news, a massive featherweight fight announcement. We are getting Arnold Allen versus Movsar Evloev at UFC 297 in January of next year. This is going to be my reaction and early prediction, and I'm also going to attempt to predict what the main event of UFC 297 will be, which is supposedly going to be in Toronto, Canada. And also, I'm going to look at the featherweight division and give my best guess on who I believe the rest of the top 10 will face in their next fights over the next 6 to 8 months. But starting off with my reaction to this matchup, I absolutely love this fight. You have Arnold Allen, who was undefeated in the UFC up until his loss against Max Holloway in his last fight. And I know he lost the fight, and I don't believe in elevating guys off of losses, but I do believe there's some key takeaways you can take away from this Max Holloway fight. A lot of people go out there against Max Holloway and get absolutely wrecked. Look what happened to Calvin Kattar. Arnold Allen, even though he clearly lost, he had a very competitive fight with Max Holloway, who is the consensus second best featherweight right now. I know he has the 3 losses to Alexander Volkanovski, but he just seems like he's kind of in that no man's land where he's killing off contenders. And I didn't love that matchup at the time, considering I'm like, oh, Arnold Allen's kind of one of those guys who hasn't fought Alexander Volkanovski yet, and you're feeding him to Max Holloway. But he lost the fight. But I still think he put up a valiant effort. You look at the fight before that, he beat Calvin Kattar. There was kind of the overshadowing of the Calvin Kattar injury, but you had the fact that Arnold Allen was winning that fight prior to the injury. The fight before that absolutely demolished Dan Hooker. I'm surprised Dan Hooker didn't accuse him of being on steroids. But we did have the fact that Dan Hooker was on the downslope at the time, and then also he was coming down a weight class, so it's kind of questionable there. The fight before that was a win over Sadiq Youssef. Sadiq Youssef is still trying to make his way into that kind of, top 10 discussion in the featherweight division. But either way, Arnold Allen is considered one of the elite in the division. But he's still a little bit unproven considering, you really put in context some of his recent fights and his recent wins. And then you look at Movsar Evloev. He's in a very similar situation. It's even a little bit worse because Movsar Evloev has really never had a big test yet in his UFC career. His last fight was supposed to be against Bryce Mitchell. Now, he was supposed to fight Bryce Mitchell even on short notice. People forget this. The UFC was scrambling to add some fights to UFC 288 because it wasn't looking very good. They added Movsar versus Bryce Mitchell on short notice. Bryce Mitchell then pulled out like 2 weeks before the fight. The UFC signed Diego Lopez. And a little bit of cold water got thrown on Movsar Evloev because even though he clearly won the fight, Diego Lopez is so scrappy. His jiu-jitsu is unbelievable. He was able to do some damage to Movsar. And because he was making his debut against a top 15 ranked Movsar Evloev, and the fact that he was competitive, it was almost like, oh, Movsar Evloev was overrated. He's not that good, even though he clearly won the fight. And overall, I think it was a 30-27 performance, if I'm not mistaken. You go back before that, he absolutely demolished Dan Ige, which I think is a quality win, but it's still not a great, crazy, top 10 win. It's not a staple win. And then before that, you're looking at Hakeem Dawodu. You're looking at Nick Lentz. So he really doesn't have those wins, but he's this undefeated contender. I still regret that we never got Movsar Evloev versus Ilia Topuria, both when they were, making their way up the ranks. I don't think either one of them was ranked. If they were, it was on the outskirts of the top 15, and they're both undefeated, which they still are, and I really wanted to see that matchup. I think that was scheduled for UFC 270, where it was Francis Ngannou versus Cyril Gane. I would have loved to see that matchup. We never got to see that, and now he's really getting a massive step up in competition against Arnold Allen, and I believe this fight is more important than a lot of people realize because you look at the landscape of the featherweight division right now. Max Holloway, not fighting Volkanovski anytime soon. Yair Rodriguez, not fighting Volkanovski anytime soon. Already lost to him. Brian Ortega, same situation. Arnold Allen, obviously, we're talking about him. Ilia Topuria is probably next in line. Josh Emmett, nowhere close to a title shot. Calvin Kattar, Giga Chikadze, same situation. So you look at this division right now, outside of Topuria, which supposedly will get the next shot, you have the winner of Arnold Allen versus Movsar Evloev. If Volkanovski reigns over this division for a little bit longer, another year or so, the winner of this fight, this could potentially be a number 1 contender fight, to be quite honest, because they need some fresh meat for the division. Now, Volkanovski could go up a weight class, but even so, the winner of Arnold Allen versus Movsar Evloev will be in a very good spot to potentially fight for a vacant belt or fight for an interim belt if Volkanovski says, oh, I'm going to go up and fight Islam again, but I'm going to come right back down and defend my belt even if I lose, or if I win, maybe I'll vacate it then, and then will make the interim champion the undisputed champion. But the winner of this fight is going to be in a very good spot because Arnold Allen's ranked number 4, Movsar Evloev's ranked number 9. If Movsar Evloev wins this fight, he's going to make a massive jump up in the rankings. And I just think you look at the division right now, because Volkanovski's the champion, because he's beaten almost everyone in the top 10, because he's kind of cleared out the division, whoever wins this fight is in a very good spot because they've never fought Volkanovski. That is it. They've never fought Volkanovski. And you look at Movsar Evloev, he's undefeated. So if he beats Arnold Allen, let's say he were to finish Arnold Allen, the UFC is going to be promoting that. Oh, Alexander Volkanovski. Let's say Volkanovski's coming off a win over Topuria. Oh, well, now it's the next guy up. It's Movsar Evloev, undefeated. And you look at both Arnold Allen and Movsar Evloev, they're 29 years old. They're arguably just hitting their prime. And I absolutely love these types of matchups. This is like a perfect fight night main event matchup. Now, I'm not sure if this will be like a co-main event or maybe a featured fight on the main card of the UFC 297 pay-per-view, but I just think it's a banger matchup. This is a perfect fight. I love it. And skill for skill, both guys are very highly skilled. Arnold Allen, one of the most well-rounded fighters in the featherweight division. I mean, he has excellent striking. He has good power as well. He has good jiu-jitsu, good grappling, good wrestling. There's really no holes in Arnold Allen's game. And then you look at Movsar Evloev, excellent jiu-jitsu, excellent wrestling. His striking is improving. He showed that against Dan Ige. He didn't just out-grapple Dan Ige. He also outstruck him and really beat him up pretty badly on the feet. And I know people are going to say, oh, well, Movsar Evloev was in bad positions against Diego Lopez. Diego Lopez is an absolute savage. That guy is constantly looking for submissions, constantly looking to set up triangles and arm bars and whatever else he can find. And I think Diego Lopez has a very promising future in the UFC featherweight division as well. And also, again, Movsar took the Bryce fight on short notice. He didn't even have a full camp for that. And then he switches out like a week or two before for Diego Lopez. That's no easy task by any means. So I think we have to pump the brakes a little bit on that, saying, oh, he's overrated because he had a kind of competitive fight with Diego Lopez. If I'm not mistaken, I think he won that fight 30-27, but I absolutely love this fight. In terms of an early prediction, this fight's hard to predict. I've been very high on Movsar Evloev, and Arnold Allen, I've also been very high on him as a prospect in the featherweight division. But for an early prediction, I'm assuming this is going to be 3 rounds. It's going to be on a pay-per-view, so it's not going to be the main event. I'm assuming it's going to be 3 rounds. I'm going to go Movsar Evloev. I think Movsar Evloev can get it done. I think his striking's improving rapidly. I think his grappling's really good. And I think it's going to be one of those really tough, close technical fights where it could go either way. I'm going to say an early prediction. I'm going to say a really scrappy 29-28 decision win for Movsar Evloev. He stays undefeated and potentially puts himself in line for a UFC featherweight title shot, potentially against Alexander Volkanovski if he's still the champion. Now, UFC 297 takes place, supposedly, it's not officially confirmed by the UFC yet, as it's going to be in Toronto, Canada. And I was looking through the UFC rankings, and I was looking at all the different champions, and I was thinking, well, who could main event this card? You look at flyweight, Alexandre Pantoja, that's not happening. He has a fight booked for UFC 296. You look at bantamweight, could it be Sean O'Malley? Sure, it could be, but I doubt they're going to put him in Canada. They're going to put him in Vegas. Volkanovski, he's an option. There's been some talk about him fighting in early 2024. We'll come back to him. Lightweight, Islam Makhachev, fighting in late October. They're not going to put him in Canada in January. Just not going to happen. Welterweight, Leon Edwards, defending in December. Middleweight, Sean Strickland. It's possible, but very doubtful. His next fight is going to be massive. It's either going to be against Israel Adesanya in the rematch, Khamzat Chimaev, or potentially Dricus du Plessis. They're not going to put that fight in Canada. Light heavyweight, we already have Jamal Hill's technically still the champion, but he's vacating the belt. You're having a light heavyweight vacant title fight in November at UFC 295. Yuri Prohaska versus Alex Pereira, so you can kind of rule that out. Heavyweight, John Jones is fighting in November. That's not going to happen. So basically, you're left with either Volkanovski or one of the women's weight classes. So you have potentially Weili Zhang, which I doubt that's going to happen, but it's possible that could be the main event. I think if that's on the card, it'll be a co-main event. You have women's flyweight. I doubt that's going to happen. You had Grasso versus Shevchenko too just recently. I don't think they both had surgery. I think they're going to run that back in a trilogy, so that's kind of ruled out. And then you basically have the women's bantamweight division, which is currently vacated because Amanda Nunes retired. So basically you have it narrowed down to 2 options, at least in my mind. You have basically Alexander Volkanovski defending his belt, or, and I hate to even say this, if you live in Canada, if you live in Toronto and you're thinking about going to UFC 297, I hate to say this, but there is a real chance the main event of UFC 297, it's going to be Juliana Pena versus Raquel Pennington. Now, I'm hoping, And I'm praying that that's not the main event. Now, if that's the main event, I believe the co-main event is probably going to be Weili Zhang versus Yan Xiaonan. I know people are going to say, well, that's going to happen. That's going to happen in China. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. So I think if they're going to book that as a main event, they're going to have multiple title fights. And the only other title fight that would be available to co-main event would be Weili Zhang versus Yan Xiaonan. Now, I hope this doesn't happen. At least for Canadian fans, I hope it doesn't happen. UFC 297 with a main event of Juliana Pena versus Raquel Pennington. It would be ugly as anything. I would not want to, I don't even want to imagine that world. So we're going to move off that topic. I believe that this matchup, Arnold Allen versus Movsar Evloev, gives a hint at the potential main event. And I'm not sure of this, but this is going to be my prediction for the UFC 297 main event. I think we are going to get Alexander Volkanovski versus Ilia Topuria for the UFC featherweight title. It just makes perfect sense. You know, they could make that the main event. Co-main event can easily be Arnold Allen versus Movsar Evloev. They could have one of the women's title fights as a co-main event as well. They could still throw Pena versus Pennington as the co-main event, or Weili Zhang versus Yan Xiaonan. Volkanovski versus Topuria is an absolute banger of a featherweight title fight that deserves to be a main event. So that's going to be my prediction. I think it's going to be Volkanovski versus Topuria. There's some talk of maybe Volkanovski fighting in February. There's been some talk of maybe Australia because they have that deal with Australia where they're going to go back a couple times a year. Volkanovski makes a lot of sense for that card as well. So that's why I'm not 100% sure. But I'm just thinking UFC likes to have backup plans in case a fight falls out. If you have Alexander Volkanovski or Ilia Topuria fall out of that fight, you got an easy backup in Arnold Allen or Movsar Evloev, which isn't ideal because then you still lose a banger matchup on the card, but you have an easy replacement fighter in case somebody were to pull out of the main event. So my official prediction for the UFC 297 main event in Toronto, Canada will be Alexander Volkanovski versus Ilia Topuria, and I'm hoping that's going to be it. I really can't stomach the thought of Juliana Pena versus Raquel Pennington for the vacant bantamweight title. I really don't want to see that as a main event of a pay-per-view. And to start off 2024, please no. Now, as far as the rest of the featherweight division, I really think these few matchups that we can already easily put together, I think you can make an educated guess, and I think I can match up the rest of the featherweight division. You look currently at the rankings, so we have Volkanovski. I believe he's taking on Ilia Topuria, who's currently ranked number 5. Number 1 ranked is Max Holloway. Well, who is Max Holloway going to face next? I think it's an easy matchup. It's going to be Max Holloway versus Josh Emmett. If Josh Emmett is not retiring, he's not going to fight for a title anytime soon. They don't want Max Holloway killing off potential contenders in the division anymore, so they're going to book Max Holloway versus Josh Emmett. It just makes perfect sense. Then you have number 2, Yair Rodriguez. Yair Rodriguez isn't going to fight for a title anytime soon. I think they book him against number 3, Brian Ortega. It makes perfect sense. Have the rematch. You have that shoulder injury that kind of is a cloud looming over the first fight, even though I think Yair Rodriguez caused that injury. I think it was a clean win. People kind of want to see that fight ran back. They felt like we got robbed of an actual fight because the injury happened so shortly into the fight. So I think the UFC probably books Yair Rodriguez versus Brian Ortega. They've said they're going to have an event in Mexico in early 2024. So that could be a perfect fight for that card. I don't know if that's going to be a pay-per-view or a fight night. Then you have Arnold Allen, we already know. Ilia Topuria, we already know. Josh Emmett, I've already discussed. Then you have Calvin Kattar. Who could Calvin Kattar fight next? I think it's a no-brainer as well. It's Bryce Mitchell. Bryce Mitchell sitting at number 10. Calvin Kattar sitting at number 7. Bryce Mitchell just had a win over Dan Ige. Even though I thought he lost the fight and I thought it was kind of a robbery, it makes perfect sense for Bryce Mitchell to get a jump up the rankings now. Why shouldn't he fight Calvin Kattar? You have Calvin Kattar right now who's been sitting out since that knee injury, but that was October of last year, so he's been out for about a year. He probably is going to return over the next 3, 4, 5 months, I would assume. Bryce Mitchell just fought, so I'm assuming he's not fighting. Probably not even, the earliest would probably be December this year. So that could be on the January card too. The UFC could book up that January card with nothing but featherweight fights. I think Calvin Kattar versus Bryce Mitchell makes perfect sense. Then you get down the rankings even further. You have Giga Chikadze. Now, Giga Chikadze, who do you match him up with right now? Now, let's say Josh Emmett retires. Giga Chikadze has been calling out Max Holloway. So you could book Max Holloway versus Giga Chikadze. I just hate to have potentially Max Holloway killing off another contender, but nonetheless, that's a fight Giga wants. That's an interesting matchup, and you still have a couple other contenders in the mix in the featherweight division. But let's say that's not the fight. Let's say they book Max Holloway, Josh Emmett, which I believe they will. You can book Giga Chikadze versus Sadiq Youssef if Sadiq Youssef defeats Edson Barboza. Now, if Edson Barboza defeats Sadiq Youssef, which takes place, I believe, October 14th, it's in the next couple weeks, then you're kind of in a tricky spot. I think basically you're going to have Giga Chikadze kind of wait it out. He just fought semi recently. and got a win semi-recently after returning from a long layoff against Alex Caceres. But I think if you have an opportunity where Edson Barboza wins, they've already ran that fight. We've already seen Giga Chikadze versus Edson Barboza. So I don't think that fight's going to happen. So otherwise, you're looking at a Giga Chikadze who's going to have to fight like a Dan Ige or maybe a Laron Murphy making his way up the ranks. I don't think that's going to happen. In the next 3 to 4 or 5 months, I think we'll get some more clarity. Giga Chikadze probably wants to take a little bit of time off. Then we can have, look at the division then, and he could potentially look for another fight. But I think if Sodiq Yusuff wins, we'll probably get Giga Chikadze versus Sodiq Yusuff. So just to go through that one more time. Alexander Volkanovski versus Ilia Topuria, main event of UFC 297. Max Holloway versus Josh Emmett. I'm not sure when that's going to happen. Yair Rodriguez versus Brian Ortega. Arnold Allen versus Movsar Evloev, which is the fight we talked about here. Josh Emmett versus Max Holloway. Already said that. Calvin Kattar versus Bryce Mitchell, which actually is a banger. And then obviously I've already gone through the rest of it. Movsar Evloev versus Arnold Allen. That is what I believe will be every single matchup for the top 10 of the featherweight division. And I love all those fights. I absolutely love all those fights. And I love that they're going to happen around the same time. I hope UFC 297, I would love to see 3 or 4 top 10, top 15 ranked featherweight fights. They're kind of all on the same timeline. A bunch of them just recently fought. Alexander Volkanovski fought in July, but he's healing up from an injury. Probably going to fight in January, February. It makes perfect sense to put them all very close together, even on the same card. Would absolutely love that for UFC 297. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Who do you think wins, Arnold Allen or Movsar Evloev? Let me know. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And thank you so much for watching.